Well, my name is Francis Thicke. I live in Faifield, Iowa area. I have a grass-based organic dairy farm. So we milk about 90 cows here. And it's grass-based, meaning the cows get fresh grass twice a day during the summer, spring and fall. And we process our milk on the farm here. And we market it all locally. So we have bottled milk and yogurt and cheese. And we only market it within about a 5-mile radius of our farm through 3 grocery stores and about 20 restaurants locally. I grew up on a dairy farm in Minnesota. And the first time I went to college, I got degrees in music and philosophy. And then I came back and farmed for 9 years on the home farm with my brothers and my father. And then went off to graduate school and got some graduate degrees in soil science. From there I went to work at USDA in Washington, D.C., where I served as the national program leader for soil science for the USDA Extension Service for a while, and then came back farming again. In 2010 I ran for Iowa's Secretary of Agriculture. And the reason I ran was to try to bring out some of the issues that are important, that are often overlooked or intentionally not talked about here. And for example, water quality is a big issue, and we often don't really get a deep enough understanding of what the problems are in our water quality to even know how to address them properly. It seems like the leaders, political leaders, don't really talk in much detail about the real problem. And we have the additional problem that some of the ag groups in Iowa, they actually try to obscure the issue a bit. They spin a good story, and they don't really acknowledge the real problem, what the root of the problem is, and what it will take to solve our water quality problems. There seems to be some misunderstanding about the real source of the nitrate problem in Iowa's rivers. We hear from some politicians and from ag groups that, well, the cause is the weather and the fact that Iowa's soils are very productive and rich in nitrogen, that there are 10,000 pounds per acre of nitrogen in the soil, and that's the cause of the problem. No, that's not the cause of the problem. It's true that there are 10,000 pounds per acre of nitrogen in the soil, but that's in the organic matter. It's bound in the organic matter, and it's held fairly strongly, but it turns over through the biological activity in the soil. And so, and that turnover in a natural ecology involves both the soil microbes and the plants. So like, for example, when the prairie grasses were here, they're perennial plants, and they had live roots in the soil year-round. And so when that nitrogen turns over, the plants will scavenge the excess nitrate, and it never gets away into the rivers. When you have perennial roots in there, very, very little nitrate will leave. But the problem is that we've broken that cycle. And that cycle of cycling those nutrients from the soil microbes to the plants and back and forth. And when you take out the perennial crops and you have annual crops, then you only have live roots in the soil for about 4 or 5 months of the year. And so for most of the year, there are not live roots in the soil. So you've broken up that process of cycling the nitrate in the soil, and now suddenly there's a lack of roots to scavenge the free nitrate. And so now when the water comes through the soil, it'll take that nitrate with it and to the tile drains, and then from there to the rivers. And so it's true we have very rich soils, but that's not the problem. The problem is that our cropping system is flawed. It doesn't have live roots in the soil year-round, and so we've broken that relationship between plants and the soil. That's why cover crops are effective, because cover crops are planted at the end of the cropping season, and then, for example, cereal rye is planted most frequently as a cover crop. So after the corn and soybeans are dead for the year, then the cover crop begins to grow, and then those roots penetrate into the soil, and they will scavenge that nitrate. And they're not as efficient as perennial crops, but they do help a lot. The research shows 30 to 40% of the nitrate can be prevented from leaching by using cover crops effectively. And so that's the part that isn't very well understood by the public, and in part because some of the ag groups are trying to obscure it and trying to confuse people. It's really the cropping system that is flawed. That's the problem that causes leaking. Because as I was pointing out, the corn and soybeans only grow for about 5 months of the year, and then during the other part of the year, the soil is not protected from leaching and from erosion. And so we have more erosion and leaching of nitrate. And so we need to fix that problem. And there are various ways to do it. One is to use cover crops that will scavenge that nitrate. The other is to collect the nitrate out of the tile drains at the end and to turn it back into nitrogen dioxide that goes up in the atmosphere, because our atmosphere is about 79% nitrogen already anyway. And so that will denitrify it if we do things like wetlands or biofilters and so on. Cover crops are effective, and what's especially effective is that over time they become more effective, because when you use cover crops every year, you're putting all that organic matter back in the soil, and you're starting to build up your soil organic matter. And so that increases your soil water holding capacity, it increases your soil organic matter, and it protects the soil from erosion. So it does a lot of things that help build soil quality using cover crops. So you'd think everybody want to do it, but it costs money to put the cover crops in on a short-term basis. And at first getting started, there can be some complications. It's a learning curve to using cover crops. And the benefits accrue more over time. And so the benefits aren't something you're going to necessarily notice as much the first year or two. You're going to notice them more and more as time goes on. So, and there's not much motivation. We talk about, we have a voluntary water quality program. And what's the motivation? Because the practices that farmers need to use cost money. And so there's no motivation for farmers to use it. You know, historically, that's been the case. Now, and I've been involved with water quality issues for some time. I worked at the U.S. Department of Agriculture in the late 1980s. In the late 1980s, we launched a national water quality initiative. It was very comprehensive. It was research and education and technical assistance for farmers and financial assistance for farmers, targeted areas to try to improve the water quality. And interestingly, USDA at that time had the philosophy that it's going to be a voluntary program. And we thought within 5 years, we should be able to see the results and improvement in water quality. And if not, we may have to consider regulation. Now that was 25 years ago or more. And we're on what I call the voluntary water quality merry-go-round. Every 5 years or 10 years, we get some new politicians in office, and they have the brilliant idea that we need to have a water quality initiative, a voluntary water quality initiative, that we can do it all voluntarily. And that goes around for about 5 years, and then everybody kind of forgets about it. And then we get new politicians in, and then they suddenly have this brilliant idea that we need a voluntary water quality program. And it never really takes off because it costs farmers money to do the practices that they need to do. I don't believe it's going to ever happen on a voluntary basis. And I think there's really a precedence for how we could do this. The people who oppose regulation say, well, you can't, every farm is different, so you can't have regulation because you can't have one size fits all. They say, well, we can't have regulations for that reason. But I'd like to point out that we do have a program already that farmers use as a regulatory program that has flexibility, and that is soil conservation plans. In the 1985 Farm Bill, Congress mandated that every farmer who's going to get subsidies, federal subsidies, has to have a soil conservation plan on the farm that will reduce erosion to a tolerable level. And so virtually every farm has a soil conservation plan. And the key thing about it is that they can choose, every farm can choose practices that work on their farm, but that will meet the T value. And to find out if it will meet the tolerance value, there is a complicated program, a computer model that USDA has put together that incorporates all the research, very much research in soil erosion. And that's all in there. So if you put it into practice, it'll tell you what you can expect to reduce your erosion on, or your combination of practices, what your erosion is expected to be. We could do the very same thing with water quality. We could require every farm to have a water quality plan, and that would give every farmer flexibility. They could choose practices that they want to use in their farm. It could be for cover crops, it could be a biofilter, it could be wetlands, but they would choose what they want to use in their farm. And then we have all this water quality data that could be put together into a model that would be able to predict, we already have that knowledge, predict what the erosion, the water quality or nitrate leaching potential would be. We could have it for both nitrate and phosphorus, what the loss potential is. And so every farmer would have to meet a tolerance level for nitrate and phosphorus. So I think that's the ideal kind of a thing. It's required, it would be required, but yet it would allow the farmers to have flexibility to do what would work on their own farm. I think that the farm organizations in Iowa and actually around the country, particularly in the Midwest related to nitrate leaching, have sort of are on this idea that they're going to try to kick the can further down the road. If they can confuse the public a little longer, then they can have another 5 years maybe before they have to do something. And so, for example, we see the Iowa I think it's called Iowa Partners for Clean Water, a new organization that's funded by some long-term farm organizations. And basically, I've seen some of their ads on TV. They're just confusing the issue. They're saying that it's caused by the weather. They're saying it's caused by Iowa's fertile soils, and that's total BS. It's really wrong. It's true that Iowa has fertile soils. It's true that weather can aggravate it. But when you set up the conditions for the problem, then it's going to happen. And weather will maybe make it worse or better. But if we did it right, if we had the right farming practices, farming systems on the ground, the weather would not be a big factor in the nitrate leaching. We could reduce the nitrate leaching to an acceptable level. Management is a key issue, but it's interesting that the research shows, and the science assessment from the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy is very comprehensive and very good. But what's interesting in that science assessment, it shows that the nitrate that gets into the river is not so much from over-application of nitrogen fertilizer. It's from the flawed cropping system that only has live roots in the soil for less than half of the year. The research shows that by fine-tuning our nitrogen application rates, managing nitrogen better, we can reduce the nitrate leaching by about 10%, which is good. We need to do that, but that's not going to solve the problem. But for example, if we use cover crops effectively, we can reduce nitrate leaching by 30% or more if it's even done well. And so that's a more effective practice, and there are other practices that can be used. It's not, and that's another misconception, that people think, well, we just need to refine our nitrogen application. We need to become more efficient in our nitrogen application. That's not going to solve the problem. The problem is more systemic than that. It has to do with the whole cropping system is flawed as it is used today. And soil loss is a big issue. According to USDA research, the average erosion rate for corn and soybean production is 5.7 ton per acre per year. Also according to long-term research and many different kinds of research studies, it shows that the soil regenerates at a rate of about a half a ton per year on average. So it regenerates at a half a ton per year, and we're eroding it at 5 ton per acre or more. So we're eroding at 10 times the rate of the regeneration. And so we're on an unsustainable course as it is with soil erosion. And that is really only the baseline erosion. And with the severe weather events we've had in recent years, Iowa State University research shows that the erosion has been much worse in recent years due to these extreme events. For example, in 2008, was it 10% of Iowa's cropland lost 20 ton per acre or more of soil from just that one event, that erosion, that one flooding event. And so our erosion is a big problem. And so there are other reasons why we need to have more resilient cropping systems on the ground here in Iowa. The soil conservation plans that we have on the farm have to meet a certain T value or tolerance level. And that's generally about 5 ton per acre. And now that doesn't mean that it's really tolerable or that it's really sustainable. This T value was kind of agreed upon by a political compromise. And so Iowa's rich soils can take that for a fair while in northern Iowa, but in southern Iowa, much of our land is steeper and very hilly, and erodes more easily. And there are a lot of places in this part of Iowa, southern Iowa, that on the side hills, virtually all the topsoil is gone. We're down to the subsoil. When you think about Iowa's rich soils, Iowa has some of the most productive soils in the world, but 12,000 years ago, when the last glacier receded from northern Iowa, there wasn't any soil at all where the glacier receded from. And northern Iowa was just a desolate wasteland, geologic wasteland. And only over time, as plants and animals colonized that loose geologic material, that they actually began to create soil. And they did that through putting organic matter into that loose material. And so in 12,000 years, that ecological process created some of the most productive soils in the world. And that's pretty amazing to think about how that happened. It's also true, though, and Iowa State University research will show that we've lost about half of our topsoil to erosion since we started farming in Iowa. And we've lost about 60% of that organic carbon, that black organic matter, since we started farming. So we've been deficit spending our ecological capital for many years here now. And we can't do that forever. That's not sustainable. And so we're going to need to look at more resilient cropping systems. And we're going to need to look at systems that mimic that natural process of ecology that created our soils in the first place. And in my case, on my farm, I use a grazing system that does that. And if we think about the process that created the soils, the bison were there and the prairie grasses were there. And the prairie grasses were famous for being very tall and deep-rooted. And the bison, big herds would come through and they'd graze off that tall prairie grass. And then when the plant was short or trampled down, it didn't need all that root mass, and so it would slough some of that root mass off into the ground. And then it would grow a new top, and then it would grow more roots. And each time the bison grazed through, they would actually pulse some of that organic matter deep in the soil. And so that's the process that created these rich, black, deep soils. And so that's kind of the process that managed grazing farmers do. On my farm, I milk about 90 cows, and they come home for milking twice a day. And I have my pasture split up into about 60 small pastures or paddocks. And so twice a day after each milking, they go to a new grass paddock and back, and then the next. So they rotate around, and then as they rotate around, the first pastures that they grazed will regrow. And so it's kind of like the bison running around the prairie, is that only I can control very closely how much. I only give the cows as much as they can eat at one 12-hour meal, basically, between milkings. And so there are many advantages to that. And one is that it increases the biodiversity, and the root, and then I let the plants grow tall and they grow a deeper root. And then so we're not only helping the plant diversity, but we're also improving the soil by allowing the root mass to go down there. And we're also improving the health of the animals, because the cows are in their natural environment, eating their natural diet, and so they're healthier. They don't give as much milk as cows standing on concrete eating corn in a confinement operation, because corn is a high energy food, but corn is not suited for the cow's rumen. And so cows that are giving a lot of milk in confinement and eating a lot of corn, they tend to only last a couple of years in a milking string, whereas grazing cows give less milk per cow, but the inputs are much less, and the cows can live. My oldest cow just calved here at 13 years old. So, for a cow to make it 10 years old is not unheard, it's fairly common in my herd. And so if we do it in that, if we kind of mimic the ecology, we not only improve the health of the animal, but the health of the soil and the health of the biodiversity of the landscape, of the plant community, but also the people, because the research shows that cows eating grass, their milk and meat is higher in omega-3 fatty acids, conjugated linoleic acids, and other healthy attributes. And we can see when the cows go on grass early in the spring, the milk turns from white in the winter to a rich yellow from the grass pigments that come through and so on. So it's a healthier product all the way around. And so I like to argue that if we do it right, we can farm in ways that will actually enhance our natural resource base. We tend to think that the longer we farm, the more we compromise the environment. And actually history bears that out here in the last 150 years, is that we've lost half our topsoil, we lost over half of our organic matter. And so we've been deficit spending, but now we can actually, if we design it right, we can begin to rebuild our natural resource base. Well, I think one of the problems is that the whole mindset of today's agriculture is maximizing short-term profits on a short-term basis. And when we do that, and look at the whole business model around the country. I mean, it's all next quarter's report. And so we don't really think long-term of how we're going to build our capital, our natural capital on the farm. We could rebuild our soil. However, it would take a major change in agriculture. And people have pointed out that there's more carbon, if we're thinking about carbon, putting carbon in the atmosphere and so on. There's more carbon in the soil around the world than there is in the atmosphere. And if we think about it here in the Midwest, we've lost half our carbon from our soil. So we have the potential to double the carbon. Around the world, we'd have the potential to double the carbon in the soil. And that seems, wow, that's a good idea. It seems simple, but it would take some major changes in the way we farm. And I don't see that. We can't even make a voluntary water quality program work here in Iowa. How are we ever going to make a major change to our farming system that's going to recarbonate our soil, put carbon back in our soils? Well, there's actually an organization in Iowa called the Practical Farmers of Iowa that is really an association of innovative farmers that are doing interesting things on their farm. And for the most part, I think they have the mindset that they need to make a profit, they need to make a living, but they want to do something that will improve the environment, to make it for a healthier environment. Some are organic, some are not, some call themselves sustainable farmers, but they're doing a lot of innovative things that are helping, like to sequester carbon in the soil and to reduce nitrate leaching. So they're kind of on the cutting edge of what Iowa farmers are doing. And so, and the thing is that we can solve all these problems, but we have to have the mindset. And unfortunately, it'd be good to have the support of the farm organizations in Iowa, the agricultural organization, but they seem to be more interested in spinning a tale than in recognizing what the real problems are and addressing them.